The semi-limit list is for cards that can only be at 2 copies in your deck and has always been the most rarely used one, and in recent years has been mostly reserved as a quarantine zone for previously limited cards. In this list, we're going to go over the best cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! That have been semi-limited, but not hit in any other way. And at number 10, we have Emergency Call, a normal spell that lets you add an elemental hero monster from your deck to your hand. This card has provided amazing utility over the years due to how big the hero archetype is, letting you search cards like Neos Alias and Gemini Beat decks, and Prisma and Gladiator Beast decks. This card was only semied for around a year from 2012 to 2013. Hero decks were just rogue then and much worse than the actual meta decks from the time, but since all of them got hit to a much bigger degree, Konami probably thought the poor heroes needed a slap on the wrist. Still, this is as minor of a consistency hit as you can get. You just went from having 4 cards that could search heroes to 3, since Rhoda is a limited card that searches pretty much the same cards. E-Call was Hero's best consistency card for years, and is pretty much as good of an archetypal searcher as you can get. However, later on this card would fall off a bit, due to the archetype having even better consistency cards. A Hero Lives, a card that summons out an elemental hero for half your life points from your deck instead, would eventually come to compete with E-Call once the game got fast enough for life points not to matter, and for elemental heroes with good effects to come out. Nowadays, since the card has recently come back to 3, some hero variants even skip an E-Emergency Call entirely, and this is why this card is only at the 10th spot on this list. And at number 9, there's Creature Swap. This is a normal spell that lets each player choose one monster they control and then switches control of those chosen monsters, but they cannot change their battle positions this turn. Creature Swap was actually hit for several years, being on the semi-limited list from 2003 all the way until 2008. Stealing monsters is an effect that has made many cards spend decades on the ban list, so it's not really a surprise this card was at 2 for so long. Letting your opponent choose the monster to give you was usually not that bad of a condition, since you could just use it when the only monster your opponent had was something you'd want to steal. Having to give something to your opponent actually gave this card insane combo potential with some cards. Spirit monsters would trigger their obligatory end phase effects under their opponent's possession, making them come back to your hand after being given. Recruiters like Mystic Tomato that float into other monsters when destroyed by battle could be given to your opponent, and then if you beat over them, they trigger in your graveyard and give you another monster from the deck. What's interesting about Creature Swap is that not soon after it was put on the list, Enemy Controller was released, and it was generally seen as the better card. Econ could tribute a monster to take control of an opponent's until the end of the turn as a quick play spell. Despite not letting you keep the monster forever, it ended up seeing way more play than Creature Swap due to the versatility of being a quick play spell, as well as having another effect to change a monster's battle position. Still, some BA decks would choose to play it over Econ anyways. And at number 8, we've got yellow, green, and red gadgets. These 3 cards all have pretty much the same effect, where if they're summoned, they get to search another color from the deck. Green fetches red, red fetches yellow, and yellow fetches green. The gadgets shook the meta upon release and continue to see play for years afterwards. Normal summons that give you a +1 in card advantage were quite rare at the time, and the good ones were all on the ban list. These cards provided you with that, but for every turn the game went on as long as you still had gadgets in the deck. They put each color to 2 for just a single format ranging from late 2007 to early 2008. Despite it being such a huge hit, since you're much less likely to see your gadgets and their advantage generation was much less, they still kept seeing heavy play at the time. Gadget decks were very good at out-resourcing opponents and always winning on board presence. Because of their small stats, with the biggest one being a green at 1400 attack, these decks would max out on all forms of removal. And because of their typing, they'd pair well with another staple in the format in Cyber Dragon, since they could all be boosted with limited removal for OTKs. The Infinite Fodder paired along well with tribute monsters too, making Gadget Monarch a quite popular variant as well. However, they'd soon lose their grip on the meta with the release of new cards leading to more explosive strategies, such as Dark Arm Dragon and Gladiator Beast decks. Still, even if they weren't the best anymore, gadgets remained a very competent engine for years. They got boosted by the Machina cards, since Machina Fortress required machine monsters to be discarded to special summon itself, and extra gadgets were very good to pitch as a cost. Then, during the Xyz era, Tin Goldfish and Kage Tokage were used together with them to spam rank 4s, since these would help you swarm the field with gadgets refilling your hand. And at number 7, we have Archlord Kristya. This is a level 8 light fairy monster that prevents either player from special summoning while it's on the field. It can be special summoned from your hand if you have exactly 4 fairies in your graveyard, and when summoned this way you can add a fairy from your graveyard back to your hand. Also, if it would be sent from the field to the graveyard, it gets placed on the top of your deck instead. Kristya set himself from the other special summon floodgates on legs at the time, since it actually didn't have any special summon restrictions on itself, letting you cheat him out with cards like Call the Haunted and Reasoning. Still, the reason why they'd eventually put Kristya on the ban list was because of the agent support that came out during the early Xyz era. The agents were a series of fairy-type monsters that had insane synergy with Kristya, since they could fill out the graveyard with fairies. They'd also be able to manipulate the number of fairies in the graveyard with their boss monster, Master Hyperion, which could banish a fairy from the graveyard to pop a card in the field. As if being a 2800 attack Vanity's Emptiness wasn't enough, it would also plus you on summon due to getting a fairy back from your graveyard on summon, letting you make up for the advantage lost by using Herald of Orange Light. The only thing holding Kristya back was being an unsearchable boss monster that required setup, and so Konami would semi-limit it together with a couple of other hits to other agent cards to keep the deck in check. It was kept on the list for around 3 years and got himself freed when the strategy wasn't that good anymore. However, decks that could cheat it out easily like Dark Lords and World Chalice would go and use it as their boss monster of choice much later, and it was still as strong as ever. And at number 6 we have Dimensional Prison, a normal trap card that can be flipped when your opponent declares an attack and lets you target and then banish that monster. This card severely power crept Sakuretsu armor on release and saw regular play for years on end. Non-destruction removal has always been highly sought after, and so both D-Prison and Caius the Shadow Monarch dominated early synchro formats. The ability to easily deal with Stardust Dragon, who could negate destroy effects as well as not letting decks like Black Wings and Lightsworns load the graveyards was huge. This card only got better as Konami released more and more destruction-proof monsters as the game progressed, such as Dracosack and Silent Honor Arc during the Xyz era. D-Prison got hit in late 2013 in what's still the biggest ban list Yu-Gi-Oh had to this day. That list aimed primarily at killing the Dragon Ruler and Spellbook decks that were running the meta at the time by banning all the Baby Rulers and Spellbook of Judgment. Konami also cracked down hard on the best forms of non-destruction removal, limiting Bottomless Trap Hole and Compulsory Evacuation Device, and of course semi-limiting Dimensional Prison. This card continued to be used in slower decks as its utility only went up with time. It was one of the best ways to deal with the fire and ice hands which got splashed into a lot of decks back then, as they could wipe out an entire board if you let them to attack into your stronger monsters. Funnily enough, this card's usage dropped off like a cliff at the time it came back to 3. It was still a decent out to monsters with good floating effects, but by then, archetypes generally had pretty good ways at dealing with battle traps before they ever got to the battle phase. And at number 5, we have Light and Darkness Dragon. This is a level 8 light dragon with the following effects. It cannot be special summoned, and it's also treated as dark while face up on the field. Then, once per chain, when a card effect is activated, this card loses exactly 500 attack and defense, and then the activation is negated. At 2800 attack and 2400 defense, it can negate 4 effects while it's face up on the field. Then, if it gets destroyed, it targets its special summons a monster in your graveyard after destroying all of the cards you control. Multiple negates on a monster is usually something you'd only see in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! But Light and Darkness Dragon lets you stun your opponent like that over a decade and a half ago. Despite the 2 tribute requirement, this card quickly became a mainstay in the meta due to its powerful, non-once per turn negation effect, usually facilitated by the tribute fodder that Treeborn Frog provided. Since the negates were mandatory, this was the card's biggest ally and enemy. A pre-errata Treeborn Frog would trigger as many times as you wish during your standby phase, letting you exhaust a Light and Darkness Dragon's negates without spending any extra resources. The floating effect was the cherry on top, especially at release since another pre-errata card in Destiny Hero Disc Commander comboed really well with that, because when special summoned from the graveyard it let you draw 2 cards without restriction. Light and Darkness Dragon was only legal at 3 for a few months before being semi-limited for 2 formats, then brought back to 3 a couple formats later. This card continued to see play in decks that could easily get out tribute fodder, such as decks that use Dandelion, which would give you 2 tokens when sent to the graveyard. Frog decks would keep using it as their main boss monster by using the aforementioned Treeborn Frog and Ronin Totem. Even Dragon Rulers would try and splash this card in as a game ender, since they generated a ton of advantage and did not need their normal summon. And at number 4, we have Reborn Tengu, a level 4 beast warrior that floats into another copy of itself when it leaves the field. Tengu completely warped the game around it when it was released, being the best kind of recruiter to hit Yu-Gi-Oh so far. It had such an impact that nowadays people refer to the format as Tengu plants, due to the popularity of both itself and Plant Engine played alongside it. Differently from other floaters, Tengu gets its effect when removed from the field in any way, which lets it bypass usual common ways to get around floating effects like banishing. Not only that, but Tengu still triggers if it leaves the field due to being used for a tribute summon or a synchro summon, so it could be used both offensively and defensively. Tengu got semi-limited first in 2012 and stayed on the list for around 3 years, only being released long after it had lost most of its relevancy. While it was at 3, it saw play either in decks that wanted a lot of value out of their monsters, such as Gadgets and TGs, or in combo strategies looking for a way to get lots of material out to make synchros like Trishula. Its popularity fell off as the game progressed, as XC-centric strategies would rise up in the meta, and Tengu itself does not trigger its effect if used as a material for an XC's monster, since these don't count as being on the field. It'd rise up as a tech in early Firefish strategies with the release of Fire Formation Tenki due to being a beast warrior as well. Though the release of more Firefish support and of a better generic Tenki target in Coat Soldier Wolfbark, a 1 card rank 4 would push it out of the meta for good at last. And at number 3, there's Judgment Dragon. The second level 8 light dragon on this list, this time with even higher stats at 3000 attack and 2600 defense. Judgment Dragon must be special summoned by having 4 or more different Lightsworn names in your graveyard, and its effect lets you pay 1000 light points to destroy all other cards in the field, and it also mills 4 cards during each of your end phases. The Lightsworn archetype is comprised of a series of light monsters that either mill cards from your deck or benefit from being milled themselves. Judgment Dragon was pretty much the first great archetypal boss monster with a huge body and a not once per turn field nuke. There was very little counterplay to this card short of negating its summon at the time it came out because priority was a thing. You could declare its effect before your opponent could respond with something like a Raigeki Break. The only thing that held this card back was how it lacked the Lightsworn name itself, and so it couldn't be searched out with cards like Charge of the Light Brigade. So not only was there not a good way to find it for years, you also had the chance to mill all of your Judgment Dragons before you could draw them. And that's why Lightsworn decks would often play Monster Reincarnation as well. All of this is why Konami decided to give it a little bit of a consistency hit by putting it to 2 copies for around 3 years. Lightsworn decks were still viable and quite good for years on end, despite this and other hits. Shortly after this card was freed from the list in 2011, Konami would release a really good way to search from the deck with Eclipse Wyvern, which also had natural synergy with mill strategies, and so Judgment Dragon continued to see play in Lightsworn variants until those decks were no longer viable. And at number 2, we've got Pot of Duality. This is a normal spell that lets you excavate the top 3 cards of your deck and add 1 of those cards to your hand on a hard once per turn. Also, you cannot special summon the turn you activate this card. Duality was Konami's second Pot of Greed retrain to warp up the meta, coming at the heels of Pot of Avarice. This card was an extremely expensive staple in release, and for good reason too. Pretty much every deck wanted to play it. The game was slow enough that the restriction wasn't that big of a deal, and even many special summon heavy decks like Blackwings would opt to max it out for the consistency. Duality's presence would only get bigger when Avarice got limited, and then later on banned for years on end. No deck would pass on being able to dig for just the card they needed like that, and so they semi-limited for a couple of formats in 2012 and 2013. But that didn't stop it from being one of the most played staple cards anyway, even as the meta got faster and faster with the release of cards like Soul Charge. Duality always had its place in slower strategies such as Trap Tricks and Bujins, and it even paired well with other consistency cards that saw play then, like Card D and Reckless Greed. That's more or less where the card has been ever since, as it still sees play to this day. Modern decks like Altergeist and Flunderies still make use of the card, since it does not conflict with any of the new pot cards that have been released, like Extravagance and Prosperity. Though Duality is still very strong, its restrictions has made it very future-proof, and it's unlikely it'll ever see the list again despite heavy use at season decks that don't special summon a lot. And finally, at number 1, we have Destiny Hero Malicious. Malicious is a level 6 Dark Warrior monster with an amazing graveyard effect, where it can banish itself to summon another copy of itself from the deck. This card has been the face of the semi-limited list for years, being widely regarded as the only card with an actual reason to be at 2 copies nowadays. Despite jumping being between 3 and semi'd for several times throughout the years, Malicious never went any lower than that, being not only the best card that's ever gotten semi-limited, but also the one that has been in and out of this section the most. Despite its tiny stats at 800, Malicious was a problem as soon as it came out, due to being one of the first good graveyard effects Yu-Gi-Oh! Ever got. It was great tribute fodder for all sorts of threats, and it comboed together with Destiny Draw, which could pitch Malicious to the graveyard and make you draw 2, which was by far the best draw engine the game had. Later on, it had value in being a dark that could banish itself to manipulate your graveyard monster count for Dark Arm Dragon. With the release of Synchro Monsters, it was a staple in Teledad decks since Emergency Teleport would let you bring out a level 2 tuner from your deck to set up level 8 Synchro plays easily with Malicious. By the time that Tier 0 deck was addressed, Malicious would then be used in conjunction with Deep Sea Diva, another level 2 tuner for the same kind of plays in the new Diva hero decks. This monster would keep seeing on and off play in decks that could mill it, but its popularity mostly waned until Link Summoning came out. Then Malicious, having come back to 3 for a while now, would once again have its place in the meta by being an extremely powerful extender in all sorts of Link spam decks. Modern BA decks would play it as an excellent card to mill off cards like Dante or Gallus the Starbeast. Phantom Knight and Goki decks would play it due to being easily dumped into the graveyard, and then letting you quickly get multiple Dark Warriors on the field for Isolde or Bardiche. Malicious would eventually be brought back to its home on the semi-limited list, and then the card would rarely be splashed outside of hero decks with easy access to it. Outside of these decks, it was sometimes played as the material for Destroyer Phoenix Enforcer, together with Denier instead of Dasher and Celestial, in decks that didn't mind an extra brick, until Verte was banned and DPE stopped being splashed everywhere at least. Malicious has seen the most play out of all the other cards of this list, while also being the only card to still be at 2 out of all of them. Malicious is the most iconic semi-limited card, and the only one that has no reason to leave the semi-list anytime soon, and that's why it easily takes number 1 spot on this list. Alright, and that's the list. If you know of any other cards that have only been semi-limited that should have made this list, or have any ideas for future videos just like this one, please let us know down in the comments below.